It was a humid night in Georgia, 1945. The air hung thick with pine and dust, the kind that clings to skin and uniform cloth. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of Fort Oglethorpe, rows of German women sat on wooden benches under weak bulbs, their faces pale, their hands folded in silence. The guards outside smoked quietly, boots crunching gravel. Then, from somewhere near the mess hall, a strange metallic whir cut through the night, the sound of a film projector spooling to life. At first, no one moved. The women looked toward the sound, expecting an announcement, perhaps interrogation, perhaps propaganda. But when a beam of light burst across the barrack wall, every head turned. The white blur steadied. A woman appeared smiling, laughing, in a glowing street that none of them recognized. The prisoners froze. A few whispered, "Was das?" believing it a trick. The guards stayed near the door, relaxed, almost amused. One young MP offered paper bags filled with popcorn, the smell foreign and sweet. Some women refused, clutching their laps. Others accepted shyly, their curiosity winning over fear. For a moment, the war felt suspended. The flickering light painted their faces silver, erasing rank and ideology. There were about 500 German women held here, clerks, nurses, radio operators, part of the 370,000 Axis prisoners scattered across America. They had survived bombings, retreats, and capture, only to find themselves watching a Hollywood movie in captivity. Every laugh track, every saxophone note, sounded impossible. They had been told Americans were crude, undisciplined, godless, yet here was elegance, humor, gentleness projected larger than life. A nurse in the front row whispered that maybe this was how the victors celebrated. Another muttered, "Or how they brainwash." But as the scene changed, couple dancing in a cafe, music swelling, something cracked. Laughter escaped one of them, then another. It echoed strangely inside the wooden walls. The projector rattled on, its gears heating, the reel trembling like breath. A sergeant adjusted the focus, the light tightening on the screen. He saw the prisoners leaning forward now, their fear melting into fascination. When the credits rolled, silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. For the first time, they had seen America with their own eyes. Next morning would reveal how they had come to this place, and why captivity here felt nothing like defeat. It began weeks before that projector night, when surrender no longer felt like survival. Rain fell hard over the French coast, as German female auxiliaries, nurses, typists, and radio clerks stood in line, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the horizon where American trucks waited. The order was clear: disarm, march, board. Their officers had fled, their faith in victory already gone. When the US soldiers approached, helmets glinting under gray skies, they expected mockery or vengeance. Instead, they got silent sand blankets. The journey started from Le Havre, packed inside Liberty ships that smelled of steel, oil, and seawater. The waves slammed endlessly, but the guards treated them with a politeness that made no sense. Hot soup was ladled out, cigarettes offered, even chocolate bars for the sick. One prisoner later said, "We waited for cruelty, it never came." Every mile westward deepened the confusion. They had been told America was chaos, that its people were spoiled, violent, soft, but the soldiers keeping watch were calm, clean, disciplined. They laughed easily, talked about farms, sisters, movie stars, and something called Coca-Cola. A young woman asked what it was. The guard handed her a bottle, cold and fizzing. She gasped as bubbles touched her lip, her first taste of the world she'd been taught to hate. After 10 days at sea, land appeared. The skyline was jagged with towers, unbombed, untouched. New York, the women crowded the deck, unable to look away from streets alive with cars and neon. No ruins, no rubble, no ration lines, just abundance. For a moment, defeat felt unreal. Trains carried them south through open fields and golden light. Every station passed like a dream, children waving flags, men tipping hats, women in bright dresses laughing freely. "They don't look like monsters," whispered one nurse. Another added quietly, "Maybe we were the ones lied to." As dusk fell, the train slowed. The sign read, "Fort Oglethorpe, U.S. Army POW Camp." The gates stood open, not menacing, just waiting. Guards guided them out with gestures, not rifles. The air smelled of pine and soap, a scent unfamiliar since the war began. None of them knew it yet, but this strange gentleness was only the first shock. America hadn't broken their bodies, it was about to challenge their beliefs. The convoy rumbled into northern Georgia beneath a hot August sky, engines growling over red clay roads. Dust trailed behind the army trucks as rows of German women stared through the slats, expecting snarling dogs, floodlights, and shouting guards. Instead, when the gates of Fort Oglethorpe appeared, they froze not from fear, but disbelief. The camp looked like a small town. Wooden barracks stood in neat lines, lawns trimmed, flower beds planted beneath whitewashed windows. No rubble, no ruins, just order. When the trucks stopped, the guards didn't bark commands. They said, "Please step down," and helped the women with their luggage. It was disorienting. One whispered, "Why are they so polite?" Another muttered, "Maybe they want to confuse us." But politeness didn't stop. Every gesture doors held open. Food served warm chipped away at what they'd been told about Americans. Inside, the barracks smelled of soap and sawdust. Each woman received a cot, a folded blanket, a towel, and a bar of lemon-scented soap. Ceiling fans spun lazily above. One nurse stood staring at it like it was alien technology. Another, younger, pressed her face into the pillow and whispered, "It smells clean." For women who had lived through bomb shelters and frontline hospitals, this was luxury beyond reason. Records show Fort Oglethorpe housed around 500 German female PLAs, mostly auxiliaries captured in France. They followed strict routines: roll call, chores, English lessons, but with dignity. Geneva rules were posted in German on the wall. "You will be treated as soldiers." Many didn't believe it until dinner arrived. In the mess hall, trays clattered, spoons struck tin. Meat, vegetables, bread, real butter steam rising. The women ate in silence, some trembling. One suddenly began to cry, quietly, her spoon shaking. A guard glanced over, uncertain what to do, then looked away. Compassion was stronger than curiosity. That night, the camp glowed under soft floodlights. The air buzzed with crickets. Inside the barracks, whispers drifted. "They feed us like guests. Why? Maybe they want to show off." No one had answers. The comfort felt heavier than chains. When dawn came, the guards were still courteous, the food still warm. Yet the unease deepened, because kindness from the enemy was harder to process than cruelty, and America had just begun its quiet offensive. The next morning began with confusion disguised as kindness. A bugle call sounded softly through the camp, not harsh but rhythmic, almost musical. German women emerged from the barracks, squinting at the sun and the surprising sight before them: American guards greeting them with nods instead of rifles. The same men who had captured them now said good morning as if they were guests. For soldiers trained to fear the enemy's cruelty, this politeness felt strategic, maybe even dangerous. Breakfast was served in a tidy tin: eggs, oatmeal, coffee that steamed in tin cups. The women hesitated. One whispered, "Maybe it's poisoned." Another laughed nervously, tasting it anyway. The food was real, warm, rich. Reports from 1945 confirm POS in U.S. custody received around 3,200 calories per day, identical to American soldiers. In Nazi camps, that number barely reached 1,200. The contrast hit harder than any interrogation. Later, American nurses distributed medical kits, soap, razors, toothpaste, even sanitary pads, items the Reich hadn't supplied for years. The women stared, unsure how to react. "You may keep them," one nurse said, smiling. A senior German clerk murmured, "They fight us with comfort." She wasn't entirely wrong. Politeness became its own form of psychological warfare. The guards were instructed under the Geneva Convention to maintain discipline without hostility. Yet the result was deeper. These small courtesies began dismantling belief systems built on propaganda. Every thank you contradicted years of training that Americans were vulgar, cruel, and lawless. When one MP accidentally dropped his cap near a line of prisoners, a German nurse instinctively bent to pick it up. The man blushed and said, "Ma'am, please, that's not necessary." The women exchanged glances. Did the enemy just call her ma'am? The moment spread through camp like gossip. It made no sense. That evening, the women were allowed into a recreation area. They expected guards to shout or segregate them, but instead saw benches, shade trees, and even a basketball court. American MPs lounged nearby, radio crackling with Glenn Miller's In the Mood. The melody drifted over barbed wire, alien yet warm. That sound lingered long after sunset. Some women whispered it was the sound of victory, not theirs but America's. Others said it was something stranger, a freedom they could feel but not yet name. By the next day, the music itself would start changing them. By the third week, the camp no longer sounded like a prison. Mornings brought laughter, footsteps, and something even stranger, music. The first time it drifted through the wire, the women thought it was church bells. But then came trumpets, drums, and a rhythm no German march had ever known. The radio by the guard post crackled. Benny Goodman, a melody full of joy, improvisation, and rebellion. The Americans called it swing. Inside the barracks, a few women sat frozen, unsure how to process it. In the Reich, this kind of music had been condemned as degenerate. Listening could mean arrest. Yet here, their captors played it proudly, humming along as they patrolled. One of the women whispered, "They danced to chaos." Another, younger one, smiled faintly, tapping her boot against the floor. That small tap spread like fire. Soon, under the hum of ceiling fans, others began to move quietly, carefully, pretending to adjust their blankets while keeping time with the rhythm. The guards noticed but said nothing. According to YMCA reports, over 200 radios had been distributed across US POW camps by mid-1945, partly for moral education. In truth, they became transmitters of cultural shock. The lyrics, even when barely understood, carried emotional clarity, hope, longing, playfulness. The saxophone bends replaced slogans. The beat replaced fear. Some women whispered that maybe this was why America had so much strength, not just factories or weapons, but spirit. It was a kind of freedom they couldn't imitate, only feel. That evening, two women stood by the fence, staring at the guard's radio. A swing number faded out. Then came a calm male voice, announcing U.S. Armed Forces radio, broadcast to all POW camps. They exchanged looks. Was it deliberate? Were they being taught? The older one said, "If this is brainwashing, it's working." The rhythm didn't end with nightfall. Through the barrack walls, faint beats pulsed like a heartbeat. It stirred something unspoken, a memory of youth before uniforms, before ideology. A few hummed quietly as they cleaned their boots. They no longer recognized themselves, but the Americans weren't finished. If music could disarm suspicion, what came next would dismantle it entirely. A flickering light, a screen, and a story that would change them forever. The order came one quiet afternoon. All personnel to the recreation hall at 1900 hours. The German women exchanged wary glances. They expected another lecture on Allied victory or democracy. But that evening, when they marched inside, the lights were dimmed and a white canvas sheet hung against the far wall. A jeep idled outside, its engine humming softly, while two American MPs unloaded metal canisters marked U.S. Army Signal Corps Film Unit. No one explained. The women sat on benches, stiff and silent, the scent of floor polish and pine thick in the air. A projector stood in the center, its reels glinting under a single bulb. "Sit tight," a guard muttered, clicking a switch. The hum began steady, mechanical, hypnotic. When the beam of light shot through the dark, someone gasped. It wasn't a lecture, it was a movie. For several seconds, the image blurred and twisted, shapes overlapping on the canvas. Then it focused. An American city street, people laughing, cars honking, a woman in a dress walking fast against the wind. The German prisoners stared, jaws clenched, eyes wide. One whispered, "Das ist America." No ruins, no rubble, no fear. Just movement and color, though to them it looked almost unreal. Reports show the U.S. War Department distributed over 1,000 film reels to POW camps as part of a re-education initiative. The stated goal: show captured enemies what free societies looked like. But for these women, it wasn't education, it was shock. A camera lens had replaced the rifle, and this time, it wasn't aimed to kill. A nurse in the front row pressed her hands together, whispering that it must be propaganda. Yet when a child on screen laughed, genuine and bright, she couldn't look away. Another woman muttered, "If they lie beautifully." No one laughed. They were too busy watching. As the reel turned, faces softened. They were no longer prisoners watching an enemy's story, they were human beings watching life itself. The flicker of light painted over suspicion. One guard noticed their posture changing, tension dissolving. He didn't understand the language, but he knew he was witnessing something rare: enemies forgetting the war, if only for a moment. The film ended in silence, but something inside the women had begun to move on. The next reel would push it even deeper. By morning, Casablanca had become more than a movie. It was gossip, confession, and quiet rebellion. Inside the barracks, women whispered across bunks, piecing together meanings they barely understood. Some swore the Americans used films as mind games, a slow charm offensive. Others said the stories were real glimpses of a freer world. The debate ran like electricity through the camp. Every conversation ended the same way, disbelief laced with curiosity. One nurse, a former propaganda typist, argued that it was all staged. "They make these films to show us what they wish they were," she said. But a younger prisoner, Anna, disagreed. "No, you can't fake how she looked at him." That single sentence silenced the room. For women raised under a regime that weaponized obedience, the idea that emotion could be honest was quietly radical. That evening roll call, guards overheard fragments of those debates. Instead of reporting insubordination, they smiled. The re-education officers had expected hostility. Instead, they found curiosity, and that was more powerful than surrender. YMCA documents from 1945 record animated discussions after movie nights, noting shifts in tone and posture among female prisoners. Soon, other topics emerged: American fashion, food, even humor. A prisoner asked what peanut butter was. Another wanted to know why American women wore trousers. One MP laughed, saying, "Because they can." That answer traveled faster than any leaflet ever printed. At night, the barracks glowed faintly under moonlight. Some women sat awake, replaying movie lines, repeating English words under their breath. Freedom, love, choice. They didn't know they were learning philosophy through entertainment, but something inside them was shifting spiral. Invisible revolutions. Still, resistance lingered. A few wrote in diaries that the films were poison wrapped in charm. Others feared returning home tainted by admiration for the enemy. The war might have ended outside the wire, but inside, it was turning psychological. The camp commander noticed the change too. Attendance at screenings doubled. Even women who once sat stiffly now leaned forward, laughing softly at jokes they barely grasped. The projector had done what no interrogation ever could make them question everything, and the Americans, sensing that spark, decided to raise the emotional stakes. The next film would be brighter, softer, and far more dangerous to their certainty. The second film night came 3 days later. This time, no one had to order attendance. As the sun dipped behind the pines, women hurried from the barracks, some brushing their hair, others straightening their uniforms as if heading to church. The projector already hummed in the recreation hall, light flickering against the wall. On the wooden bench closest to the screen sat a young nurse named Hilde, her hands trembling. The reel began to spin. The first frame appeared Ingrid Bergman, eyes luminous, voice soft. The movie was Casablanca. The prisoners had heard of it from guards, who called it a classic. None knew what to expect. But when Bergman looked at Bogart and whispered, "We'll always have Paris," silence filled the hall. Every woman in that room had lost someone in a war that promised glory but delivered ashes. For them, that line was not romance, it was grief. The air grew heavy. Cigarette smoke curled under the dim lights. Some women watched with wide eyes. Others turned away when characters touched or smiled freely. In the Reich, such gestures between men and women were censored or mocked as weakness. But here, on American film, affection wasn't scandal, it was survival. One woman whispered, "She defies him and no one punishes her." Another murmured, "She chooses." These words weren't about the movie anymore. They were about something deeper: freedom, agency, the right to feel without permission. Reports confirmed Casablanca screened in several U.S. POW camps between 1944 and 1946, part of the Morale Exposure Initiative. What officials didn't predict was the emotional fallout. Many women wept quietly, confused by what the movie stirred. A Red Cross observer noted, "They seemed to grieve and hope at once." When the film ended, no one clapped. The guards didn't move either. For nearly a minute, the only sound was the projector slowing to a stop. Then someone whispered, "Do they live like this every day?" A guard, overhearing, said softly, "Most do." The answer landed heavier than any propaganda leaflet. That night, lights went out, but no one slept quickly. In bunks across the camp, women replayed the images in their minds: cafes, laughter, love unpunished. The questions born that night would soon divide the camp itself. The next screening came a week later. The notice simply read, "Film minus 2,000 hours." By now, anticipation had replaced suspicion. The recreation hall filled early, benches packed tight. air heavy with perfume improvised from soap and canteen coffee. The projector hummed, and this time the opening credits shimmered with warmth. Meet Me in St. Louis. Bright dresses, laughter, music, and Judy Garland singing about home. For women whose homes had been bombed to dust, the melody felt like both medicine and punishment. The first minutes silenced the room. Garland's smile, the golden light, the scenes of family life, it seems impossible. One prisoner covered her mouth, another turned away, whispering, "We had this once." Reports from YMCA visitors mentioned female POH openly weeping during American musicals, noting that joy itself appeared to wound them. Tonight, those reports came true. As the film rolled, a guard near the door leaned against the wall, watching not the screen but their faces. Shoulders that once squared in defiance now softened. When Garland sang "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," a young clerk named Irma began to cry so hard she shook. A fellow nurse held her hand. It wasn't homesickness, it was revelation. The idea that life could be gentle, uncommanded, free. In the darkness, whispers rose between sobs. "Their women sing," one voice said. "Hours march." A ripple of nervous laughter followed, half relief, half guilt. For a moment, the entire hall felt suspended between two worlds, the one they had fought for, and the one glowing before them. After the final song faded, no one moved. Even the guards looked uneasy, unsure if this was victory or vulnerability. The projector clicked to a stop. Then something remarkable happened. A quiet round of applause, hesitant at first, then growing. It wasn't for the Americans. It was gratitude toward something they hadn't known existed anymore. Beauty. That night, the guards carried the reels back to storage, the echo of clapping still hanging in the air. Outside, cicadas buzzed, the humid night pressing close. The women walked back to their barracks slower than usual, heads tilted upward, humming faintly. They didn't know it, but movie night had become therapy, and the Americans had just realized it. Next morning, the camp officers would debate whether kindness had gone too far. By the following week, the camp's rhythm had changed. Every conversation, every routine chore, revolved around the next movie night. The guards noticed it first. German women, who once avoided eye contact, now smiled shyly, or practiced bits of English learned from the films. What began as a psychological experiment was becoming something else, something human. And for the men in uniform, that raised a quiet question. Were they still guarding prisoners, or were they taking care of them? In the officer's hut, a young lieutenant flipped through a War Department memo labeled Re-Education Protocol, Civilian POW Integration. It advised moderation, cultural exposure, not sentiment. "We're supposed to win their minds," he muttered, "not fall for their tears." Across the table, Sergeant Harlan, who had watched Casablanca 3 times with them, shrugged. Maybe both things happen at once. Outside, the camp buzzed with routine, laundry drying on lines, guards mending fences, women sweeping barracks, porches. Yet the tone was lighter. A few MPs joked that Fort Oglethorpe had turned into a movie club. Some worried the command back in Washington wouldn't approve. Still, when headquarters inspected, they found nothing wrong. Discipline intact, morale high, 0 escape attempts. If compassion was a weapon, it was working. War Department statistics confirmed 66 major POW camps ran re-education programs by late 1945. None expected such profound emotional impact. At Oglethorpe, guards began scheduling screenings weekly. One officer confessed in a letter home, "I'm teaching enemies how to smile again. It's the strangest duty I've ever loved." But not everyone shared that warmth. A visiting colonel scolded the staff, warning, "You're softening the edge. Remember, they fought for Hitler." No one argued, yet silence hung heavy after he left. Everyone knew the truth. Cruelty was easy. Decency was the real discipline. That night, as floodlights dimmed, the guards stood outside the recreation hall listening to the faint applause echo through the walls. They weren't sure who the applause was for: the movie, the actors, or maybe the idea that even after everything, people could still feel moved. Harlan watched the glow fade and said quietly, "They'll remember this longer than the war." He didn't know how right he was, because those memories would soon find their way into letters that slipped through censorship and crossed the Atlantic. By spring, the movie nights had stopped feeling like education. They felt like escape. The projector light had become a ritual, a doorway to a world beyond barbed wire. Each film carried lessons no manual could teach: humor, defiance, tenderness. For the women at Fort Oglethorpe, fiction had become their first taste of freedom. That month's screening was a war picture, Mrs. Miniver, the story of a British mother facing air raids with calm courage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German POWs, many from bombed cities themselves, watched their enemy portrayed with grace, but instead of resentment, something else filled the room: recognition. When the character buried her son, a nurse in the front row wiped her eyes. "This," she whispered, "is all of us." Afterward, a Red Cross officer asked what they thought. One woman, her English halting but clear, said, "You fight with heart, not hate." It was a dangerous admission in any other place. Here, it was recorded in a memo marked "Attitude Shift." Surveys taken in 1946 showed over 60% of POTS reported more positive views of the Allies after cultural programs. For some, a single movie had done what months of propaganda could not: replace fear with understanding. But transformation came with guilt. Late at night, women debated quietly, if we like their world, are we betraying ours? A few refused to attend screenings anymore. "We are forgetting who we are," one said. Yet even she listened when music from the next hall drifted through the windows. Curiosity was stronger than conviction. The guards noticed the change to prisoners who once saluted stiffly, now asked questions. Do American women vote? Can they work as doctors? When told yes, they looked stunned. These simple exchanges did more to dismantle old ideologies than any interrogation ever could. The camp was becoming a classroom of empathy. And then, word spread repatriation orders were coming. Many expected celebration, but instead came unease. The women had lived a strange paradox: captive, yet more mentally liberated than before capture. Some whispered they weren't ready to go home, not to ruins, not to silence. Their final film night would arrive soon. The projector would roll one last time, brighter than ever, before everything faded back to grey reality. The first letters began appearing 2 weeks later, folded neatly, written in careful script on Red Cross stationery. Each one passed through censors before leaving Fort Oglethorpe, but even the officers scanning them paused at the tone. These were not the words of defiant prisoners. They were voices trying to make sense of kindness. "We are treated fairly," one woman wrote. Another confessed, "They showed us a film about love. I cried. Please don't tell anyone." Under Geneva rules, POWs could send 2 letters a month, though every word was inspected for code. Most spoke of weather, health, and routine. But between those lines lived astonishment. "There is food here," one note said. "Real butter and coffee." A nurse described the camp's garden, the sound of swing music, the politeness of guards who said "ladies." It was the kind of report that could have been branded treason in the Reich. A translator named Corporal Stingham, us naturalized, was tasked with reading every outgoing letter. At first, he expected bitterness. Instead, he found curiosity. "They ask about our movies," he told his commander. "They ask if the women they see on screen truly live like that." The commander replied, "Let them ask. Questions are victories." For the prisoners, these letters were tiny rebellions of honesty. They had been taught to despise everything American, yet now their pens betrayed fascination. Some even thanked their captors. "It is strange," one wrote, "to be freer here than we were in uniform." Those words made it past censorship only because the translator pretended not to notice. One evening, a guard caught 2 women slipping an extra sheet into an envelope. When opened, it contained a hand-drawn picture, a movie reel, shining light across a fence. The caption read, "We saw the world again." The sergeant who found it didn't confiscate it. He mailed it himself. Back in Germany, bombed cities received these letters, like messages from another planet. Families wept or raged. Some refused to believe a word, but even disbelief spread the rumor. America didn't starve its prisoners, it educated them, and that truth, once whispered, could not be undone. As spring 1946 approached, more letters carried the same tone: soft, grateful, haunted. They didn't know it yet, but those letters would be their last before the order came to go home. It was a warm evening in June 1946 when the notice appeared. Final showing 2,100 hours. The words hit like a farewell. Women who once dreaded these assemblies now counted hours until the reel began. The guards had chosen the film carefully, Gone with the Wind. Long, sweeping, emotional. A fitting curtain call for a camp that had turned war prisoners into reluctant dreamers. The recreation hall filled early. The air smelled of soap, dust, and nervous anticipation. The projector stuttered to life, spilling light across familiar faces now softer than when they arrived. When Vivian Leigh appeared as Scarlett O'Hara, defiant and unbreakable, the German women leaned forward. She wasn't just an actress, she was a mirror, a survivor refusing surrender. As the film unfolded, guards and prisoners alike sat transfixed. The war outside, the wrecked cities, the flags all vanished. Only this story remained: pride, loss, survival. When Scarlett stood in that burned field and vowed, "As God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again," something shifted in the room. A murmur spread, then silence. For women who had rationed crusts of bread in cellars and dugouts, that line was scripture. A nurse named Helga whispered, "She could be German." Another replied, "No, she's free." It wasn't envy, it was realization. Freedom, they understood now, wasn't about borders or uniforms, it was the right to start again. When the credits rolled, the lights stayed off. No one spoke. Even the guards seemed reluctant to break the spell. Finally, Sergeant Harlan stepped forward, voice low. "Ladies, that's all for tonight. Tomorrow, we begin transfers home." A few gasped softly, as if waking from a long dream. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of magnolia. The women walked slowly back to the barracks, shadows stretching across the yard. From behind the wire, one turned and looked back at the dim hall, its single bulb flickering like a dying star. "We didn't lose everything," she murmured. By midnight, the projector was packed away, the reels labeled, the screen folded. The hall stood silent again, but the stories it had shown of strength, of compassion, of ordinary grace would travel farther than the women themselves. Tomorrow, the gates would open. Tonight, their minds already had. The transport trucks rolled out at dawn, engines growling through the Georgia mist. German women sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching small bags of belongings, letters, photographs, a bar of soap, a folded blanket that still smelled faintly of the camp. The guards waved as the convoy turned toward the port. No jeers, no cheers, just quiet respect. 10 months earlier, these same women had arrived as enemies. Now, they were leaving as something far stranger, witnesses to decency. Their ship crossed the Atlantic under grey skies, a mirror of their uncertainty. When the coast of Europe emerged, it looked hollow. From the deck, they could see ruins stretching in land towns gutted, rivers choked with debris. One whispered, "So this is what we come back to." Another answered softly, "After seeing their world, how do we live in this one?" By mid-1946, more than 7 million German POWs had been processed through Allied custody, yet few had stories like theirs. Reporters in Bremen documented returning prisoners describing America as strangely gentle. Families didn't believe them. Mothers accused daughters of lying. Neighbors called them naive. One woman later recalled, "They laughed when I said Americans showed us movies." The laughter hurt more than captivity ever had. Back home, the women found a country buried under its own silence. Buildings gone, men missing, ideology cracked but not dead. They tried to explain what they had seen: radios, supermarkets, swing music, respect, but the words sounded absurd amid rubble. A few kept diaries, others folded memories into letters never mailed. "I cannot hate them anymore," one wrote, "and that makes me lonely." Some found work as translators for occupation authorities, using the English they'd learned from Hollywood films. Others joined relief efforts, teaching children about empathy instead of pride. A nurse who had wept during Casablanca volunteered at a Red Cross station in Hamburg, telling friends, "If they could forgive us, I can help heal." Years later, historians would note that these women carried a quiet kind of resistance, the refusal to unlearn humanity. Fort Oglethorpe had not re-educated them with slogans, but with grace. And yet, even after the noise of reconstruction began, they still remembered the hum of that projector, because its light hadn't faded with the war. It followed them home. Decades later, when the world had long moved on, a few of those women still gathered every summer in small German towns. They were grey-haired now, their uniforms replaced by floral dresses, their memories folded like old letters. Yet every meeting began the same way. Someone would mention the projector. "Do you remember the light?" one would ask, and suddenly 1945 felt close again. Historians interviewing them in the 1990s noted the same phrase repeated across diaries and testimonies. That light changed everything. It wasn't the films themselves, though they remembered Ingrid Bergman's eyes, Judy Garland's voice, Scarlett O'Hara's vowet, was what those images represented. Compassion without agenda, power without humiliation, freedom without fear. They had witnessed an empire of empathy, projected frame by frame. For many, that memory outlasted politics, marriages, even health. One survivor, Anna Keller, wrote, "I still dream of that beam of light cutting through the dust. It was the first time I saw life instead of ideology." Another, now in her 80s, told a researcher, "We learned democracy from a movie screen. No bitterness, no shame, just wonder." Some returned to America years later, visiting museums or meeting former guards. One recognized Sergeant Harlan in a faded photo and wrote him a letter thanking him for showing me a world without hatred. Her handwriting shook, but her words were steady. Harlan's son later said his father kept that letter folded in his wallet until the day he died. The camp itself was dismantled in the early 1950s. The land turned into housing lots and warehouses. Nothing remained, no barracks, no fences, no projector hall, but locals still found scraps of film buried in the dirt, brittle strips of celluloid that once carried laughter through captivity. Every frame was a ghost of mercy. As night fell in their memories, the women often described the same final image, the reel slowing, the light dimming, faces turning silver, and then darkness. But even as the light died, it left a trace on their eyes, a glow they carried through the ruins, through rebuilding, through the rest of their lives. For them, World War II didn't end with surrender. It ended with a flicker of light, a projector beam, and the impossible kindness of an enemy who chose to teach through beauty.